Cancer is a death sentence for the vast majority of fictional characters. Odds are so much better for real humans. A conversation with Evan Handler ahead on Science Goes to the Movies. Welcome to Science Goes to the Movies, a look at the stories of science and how they change our culture. I'm Faith Saley, and we are delighted today to be joined by Evan Handler, actor, activist, and cancer survivor. Welcome.
Hey.
How often do you get that in your introduction, cancer survivor?
I don't get the activist very often. Cancer survivor, that comes up. Yeah.
For those of you who only know him for his work on Sex and the City, Californication, and The Breaks, Evan has also written 2 books, Time on Fire and It's Only Temporary, detailing first his terrifying battle with acute myeloid leukemia and then his subsequent effort to rejoin his regularly scheduled life already in progress. So, Evan, you were in your 20s, you had a blossoming stage career, and you go to the doctors for what you thought was a virus, and what happened?
I was understudying in a Neil Simon play on Broadway, Biloxi Blues. And Neil Simon plays in those days were often populated by non-Jewish actors on stage and Jewish understudies for some strange reason. But there was a Jewish guy playing the role of Epstein, and he was going to take Yom Kippur, one of the Jewish holidays, off. So I was scheduled to go on. But I had a flu bug that I couldn't shake, a sore throat that didn't go away. And I went to the ENT, ear, nose, and throat doctor that many Broadway actors use. And he was a little suspicious of some of my symptoms and sent me to a hematologist for blood tests. And it led to this.
And the hematologist diagnosis. Said, "You're not Jewish. You can go on."
That's right. Yes, you can go on, but your life will be over shortly afterward.
So this happens to you. You're 20 what?
Ages 24 through 29 were pretty much chewed up and spit out with that. I did have a 2-year remission. I wound up back in another Neil Simon play on Broadway, and then the expected recurrence happened, which led me to conclude that Neil Simon plays are carcinogenic.
Clearly.
Depending on your susceptibility, I guess. So there was life back and forth, but the overwhelming statistics are 80% at that point would have a recurrence. And then the survival statistics after the recurrence are less than 5%.
Survival statistics today seem a little more rosy. According to projections by NIH's National Cancer Institute, of the estimated 1,685,210 real people who got a diagnosis of cancer in 2016, less than a third of them will die. But in the movies, a cancer diagnosis is pretty much a guaranteed death sentence. Evan, isn't surviving cancer one of the most dramatic stories we could tell or witness? Why do you think your industry has sidestepped this story for so long?
The simple answer, and I can only speculate as to why this doesn't happen, but among my speculations, the simple answer is movies are a big business and they cost a lot of money to make. And there are reams of data that show that mainstream release movies that conform to genre standards of storytelling do better. And that means, a love story has to either have people get together in the end and have it be a happy story, or have a tragic ending where it doesn't happen. And a tragic ending is much more sellable, it's much more explainable, it's much more marketable than a story of somebody who walks off into an unknown future. But the fact is, there are increasing numbers of people, by the millions and millions and millions, surviving all sorts of illnesses, and there is, storytelling of that ilk is missing, because look, for the kind of movies I like, somebody walking off into an unknown future, and specifically what my second book, both books, but the second book particularly tries to talk about, is there's a cost to surviving that people are living with that is unexplored. The fact is, what I learned is that the act of surviving that you think is going to bring you into a state of no more loss or threat of loss is actually an acceptance of an unending series of losses for as long as one chooses or is lucky enough to stay alive. And that is a real truth about life that I'm sad hasn't been explored more in films and all sorts of storytelling, that bargain that gets struck, and the transition of understanding that I think this is going to be the warding off of the ultimate loss, when in actuality, for as long as I stay alive, I have to accept that unending series of losses. It'll be the loss of everyone around you, as long as if you live the longest. The loss of every job, the loss of every relationship, the loss, just the losses that accumulate as you also gain things through life.
I've never heard anybody say that. I mean, it sounds very Buddhist.
Thank you. I guess we're done now.
When you were undergoing treatment for cancer, were there any films that spoke to you, that resonated with your experience?
I think I really avoided them at that time. I mean, because I didn't want to see any tragic stories.
And that's pretty much all there were, is your point, right?
That I was aware of, yeah. I wasn't aware of any really good survival stories at that time. I know I had a girlfriend at the time, Jacqueline Reingold, who's an accomplished playwright and television writer herself, and she would kind of screen things, and even things that seemed good, she'd then go, no, you don't want to read that, you don't want to read that. It felt like really trying to forge a new path. I was by no means the first cancer survivor, but it was also unusual because of the age that I was. You know, I reemerged, and during those 6 Degrees days, I didn't have any peers that I could talk to about where I'd been for the last 4 or 5 years. I mean, there's an organization now that I work within that's great, Stupid Cancer, that's really an organization for young adult cancer survivors. And they look at me as kind of the godfather of the movement, who existed prior to the coining of the phrase.
In the movie Wit, starring Emma Thompson, and based on the 1999 Pulitzer Prize-winning play by Margaret Edson, Thompson's character, Vivian Baring, realizes that the doctors treating her see her more as a guinea pig for their treatments than as a real person worth saving. Evan, your cancer treatment was very, very intense and prolonged. Did you get the feeling that some hospitals saw you more as a person than others?
I know that there were hospitals that were much more geared toward helping you keep a life going in spite of the fact that you had to be interned there. And the treatment has changed dramatically. People aren't hospitalized for so long, even with bone marrow transplants now, as they were then. But I had to live in the hospital for a month or two at a time, and sometimes in isolation from people because of concern of infection when you had no immune system.
You talk about how you and your girlfriend, Jody, at the time would do like a 2-foot
we'd simulate hugs.
You'd simulate hugs.
Yeah. So when I found just 200 miles away from New York at Johns Hopkins, a hospital that really did gear their treatment toward continuing your life in spite of the fact that you're here, it made me question why places elsewhere didn't, and why really people who sought out medical treatments didn't even have any basis for knowing what life was like on the floors of these hospitals and how to choose. It's incredibly difficult, or it was then. The internet didn't exist then. So it's incredibly difficult to suss out what treatments you're going to get in which place and which protocols might be more beneficial to you. Everybody relies tremendously on just doctors telling you this is where you should go. And doctors that have never spent any time alone in a room with the doctors that they're recommending. They only know them in a clubby sense from socializing at national meetings and stuff like that. So patients are at tremendous disadvantages in terms of knowing what they're in for.
Evan, you were told that your chances of survival were very small. Did the science of the treatment change while you were undergoing it?
No, not while I was undergoing it, but in the year since, it has changed tremendously. Acute myeloid leukemia that I had, AML, was a very grim diagnosis in 1996. It's not a cheerful diagnosis now, but it is much more survivable than it was then. And most of that has to do with the fact that the actual treatment, bone marrow transplantation, has become the first line of treatment now, whereas then it was still considered somewhat experimental and was only used in cases of recurrence.
So the first line of treatment was chemotherapy?
It's more standard chemotherapy. I mean, a bone marrow transplant is only turbo chemotherapy anyway. It's literally, I mean, I'm using the language of the scientific language, super lethal doses of chemotherapy, after which you're given a rescue dose of bone marrow. So it's an amount of chemotherapy that would eliminate your bone marrow and blood-making capacities, and then being given, like a transfusion in a vein, bone marrow cells that know to travel through the bloodstream and go back into the interior of the bones and begin to repopulate. And my understanding is, and I shouldn't be trusted to speak with authority, but the mortality rates for bone marrow transplantation, what they now call a stem cell transplant, because they also isolate stem cells, which wasn't done back then, is on par with coronary bypass surgery. Whereas when I went through it, it was a 15 to 25% mortality rate from the procedure itself. So a lot of people didn't survive the bone marrow transplant.
So often in the movies, the person who has cancer, even though they are in the middle of one of the most dramatic events a person can experience, is relegated to a supporting role. And there are a ton of movies that use the death of a cancer patient to illuminate the lives of the healthy. None leans on this trope more aggressively than the 2015 comedy Me and Earl and the Dying Girl. So in this movie, there's this lovely young woman who's dying of cancer, and the movie is basically all about this goofy boy. And as a healthy person, I found it kind of offensive. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I'm not going to critique the movie out loud. I think I actually enjoyed that movie for what it was. I mean, it's another movie where somebody dies, you know. I didn't allow anyone to make me a supporting player in my cancer story.
You were the star?
I was. I was tyrannical. I mean, that's how I survived. I really became ruthless.
In what way?
I barred people who were distracting from my hospital room and from my life. I relegated my parents to an outside role because I didn't feel that they were functioning at their best because of their own sense of devastation. I mean, in retrospect, I had to go back and apologize to a lot of these people because my parents performed extraordinarily well, but they were traumatized, and they had other members of the family to also be concerned about. But I became ruthless in my judgment of who was performing well and who wasn't, who was being beneficial, what roles they could and couldn't play. And that was how I managed my crisis.
Do you think that's part of why you survived?
I'm sure it's part of why I survived. Yeah.
But we don't, we don't see this in cliched cancer movies. We see the person who has cancer and is probably in a movie dying of cancer to be someone who's humbled, has some kind of metanoia, is almost saintly, right? You usually don't see,
There have been some moments, they're not necessarily in cancer movies. I mean, the reason that the moment in terms of endearment is so cathartic when Shirley MacLaine screams, give my daughter the shot, is because there's truth to that. I mean, successful medical treatment, look, it's better done if you can do it without shrieking, because it's going to be better to make friends and coerce and cajole. But it's also really enraging to have to realize, to have your life in danger and realize that the only way I'm even going to get people to do their jobs at times is to bring them cupcakes and to seduce them into giving me what I need. But if that doesn't work, then I think screaming and threatening is called for. So these things, there are moments in films where it has been touched upon. But no, I don't think, and it's one of the reasons, look, I want to tell the story of what it means to walk out of the hospital and face a new life. And I would like to see one where and actually the Time on Fire screenplay really does deal quite a bit with what is necessary to get what you need on a hospital floor and the lengths that one might have to go in both demanding and in humiliating oneself, in begging, pleading, cajoling, apologizing. There's just the dynamics that are necessary to...
We don't see that. We don't see that in film and TV. And we so often see doctors as being heroic. And in many ways, people who devote themselves to healing people are heroic. But when I was reading your book, I felt like Shirley MacLaine screaming at the book, like, give him the antibacterial wipe on his tube, help this man. I mean, it's amazing how much you had to advocate for yourself, and some doctors in the portraits you paint in your book were certainly not they were not Patch Adams.
Look, there are medical professionals who are extraordinary and really deeply, deeply caring. But like in any business, it's a small number who are extraordinary at what they do. I mean, unless you're a person who knows 90% extraordinary auto mechanics or 90% extraordinary senators and congresspeople, you're not going to find 90% extraordinary physicians either.
Right.
You're going to find just as much of a dearth there as anywhere. What's And many people can understand and accept that. What they can't seem to understand and accept is that there are also just as many who are incompetent. There are just as many who are
I don't want to think of an
sadistic,
incompetent oncologist.
who are sadistic and vindictive. And it's important to realize and recognize that, and that there are poorer means of actually eliminating them than there are in other industries, because they're very well protected and they generally are not rooted out. So these are just important things to know and realize. And I think it's important to have a story told widely and entertainingly in which these issues and the ways that one needs to behave in order to survive are important, because people don't realize it.
But I have to say, I found in your book, in Time on Fire, the recounting of what went into your treatment, which takes up a lot of space in the book, fascinating. I mean, you really outline the science, and it truly was fascinating. Maybe because we're holding your book in our hands and we know you live. Like, maybe that's why I could keep tearing through it.
My interest in becoming an actor and becoming interested in dramatic storytelling was the great films of the 1970s, and let's say some of the Sidney Lumet films with Al Pacino, Dog Day Afternoon, Serpico. So what I became fascinated with and really did hone and distill eventually to be able to say it was truths that are difficult to confront, packaged in a way that was so entertaining you weren't willing to turn away. And when that intersects in my professional life and I'm able to actually make a living doing that, those are the best of days. Oddly, ironically, that may have occurred in its most pure form in the telling of my own story. Mm-hmm. But certainly, I tried to make sure that there was a graspable, insightful laugh on every page that was also revealing something very gritty and essential. So that was the task in the storytelling, and that's the trick, to get people to, why would anybody want to endure this journey unless they're really gaining some insights about their own life? And if you can tie the mundanity of people's life into the odd juxtaposition of mundanity and insanity that exists when you're fighting for your life, then you have a good story and a good journey that you can bring people along for.
Some movies about cancer are starting to treat the disease differently. In Will Reiser's semi-autobiographical movie 50-50, starring Seth Rogen and Joseph Gordon-Levitt, the character survives cancer, and he is also the lead in the film. So Levitt's character survives cancer, and it changes all his relationships dramatically. Did that happen to you? Did your relationships change because you survived cancer?
Well, I mean, everything changes. Your relationship to your life itself. I had an interesting relationship to that movie because that film successfully exploited an angle that I wanted to, which is that humor continues. If not actual humor of the illness, which I might, say, I don't find anything so funny about it, but humor. Life continues, and humor is part of life, and humor continues. That film, where it fell short for me, and I think it was a huge accomplishment and achievement. So I'm hesitant, to critique it in any, massive way. But it was a very passive character whose big outbreak was to beat the steering wheel. But it was another movie where the guy succeeded at finding love with his, hospital therapist. And it didn't get into the stuff that I really would like to see handled, which is the loss. That illness is not really a good cheerful movie might be, you go through this, but you get that. My experience was, and I'd still like to see a story told of somebody who's really reduced to nothing. Who, my story ends, Time on Fire, with somebody beginning again, really having everything taken away. Youth, hair, the love relationship. I mean, the story of Time on Fire is somebody who tries to survive because he wants to live and because there's a love relationship that he wants to live to enjoy, and his life is saved, but the relationship is destroyed, which is a much more realistic rendition. I mean, the stories that I got told in the hospital were, you're lucky your girlfriend keeps coming here, because a lot of guys come here and their young girlfriends stop coming. and they get left. So I didn't have that happen. I mean, we found that the relationship functioned best in crisis and didn't really function anymore when I was healthy.
Yeah, because the stakes were so high, right? I mean,
yeah, or that's how we served each other best. I mean, she's still, my closest friend, but
wow.
that love relationship is far, far, far in the rearview mirror.
There's a very funny scene in 50/50 where Levitt's character Adam uses his cancer as a pickup line.
Right.
And you have a scene in your first book about cancer sex.
Yeah, I would term it hospital sex more than cancer sex.
Okay.
It could be anything. But for a while, my girlfriend and I did, make best attempts to carry on a sex life in the hospital, because there were great periods of time when I was a fairly healthy guy in the hospital, except for the fact that I had a most often terminal disease. But the hospital made no accommodation to this, no accommodation to being 25 years old, and so we would hang signs on the door, "Do not disturb," which people generally didn't pay attention to. So we took to having sex in the hospital bathroom. Yeah.
Wow.
And in the screenplay, there's a scene of trying to do that and having the paper towel disposal collapse and make a lot of noise.
I feel like that's so much more impressive than a Mile High Club. Is a hospital bathroom.
I have never understood the Mile High Club for the life of me. I find
small
an
and
airplane
disgusting.
bathroom to be the most horrible, disgusting place, and I don't want anyone touching my penis in an airplane bathroom.
So cancer is not the death of
I
sex.
don't even want to touch my own penis in an airplane bathroom.
The airlines don't want you to either. So cancer is not the death of sex.
No, not necessarily. No.
And it's not the death of sperm either, I learned from your second book.
Well, the ultimate story in It's Only Temporary is extraordinary even to me to this day. I was told at the last moment that the cancer treatment would most likely render me sterile. But I was told as they were about to hook up the chemotherapy tube, we had to delay by 4 days.
Didn't they
So I could
whisk
go
you
make
out the
deposits
door
at a
and give
sperm
you
bank? Yeah.
porn magazines?
Never
Yeah.
informed about any of that. And that's an incredibly common occurrence.
Really?
Oh yes, widespread, because people are uncomfortable discussing it for whatever reasons. But
And now you have a daughter.
oodles of literature. Yeah, I went through much of my life and the early stages of my relationship with my wife convinced that I could not conceive a child. And it was only when we decided to become parents that I got tested for the first time and realized that my sperm count hadn't changed from 18, 20, whatever years earlier. And I was
Even
told...
your sperm are survivors.
Well, no, I was told that I really barely didn't have a sperm count, that I was told that you are still infertile. And you can try, but I wouldn't give it more than 1 or 2 cycles, and you're probably going to need assistance and blah, blah, blah. And my daughter was conceived the next day. So she's our miracle baby, and her conception is statistically even more unlikely than my survival.
Wow.
So it's really an extraordinary story of mispresumptions and unlikely occurrences.
And life force.
Yeah.
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 Well, she inherited that from you.
Well, her story is still being written at the very beginning stages.
Sometimes on the show, we like to ask our guests if they, were to script a movie about their subject, what should it look like? And I mean, you've already written the book. So really the question is, why isn't this a movie yet? What the heck is the holdup?
I don't know. The story is incredible. I think the screenplay is worthy. It certainly got a lot of attention.
So you have written a screenplay of your book.
I've written a screenplay that was accepted at the Sundance Institute Screenwriters Lab, and I was invited back to workshop it at the Filmmakers Lab under my own direction. But at that time, it had been optioned by a company that's no longer in existence, that I didn't any longer want to make the movie, and they threatened to sue me and Sundance. So I gave up my slot at that director's lab. I did the Screenwriters Lab, so it's been actually, not only exists, it's been, kind of embossed as worthy by a number of top entities, but still hasn't gotten successful financing.
And so your cancer movie would be someone, presumably a young man, who has a very serious form of cancer. It doesn't look good. He survives. At the end, it's not a love story. he hasn't had a spiritual awakening. He doesn't have hair, and he realizes this is what I got to work with.
It is the story of some of the things that I've described. It's the story of someone who is reduced to a sort of embryonic state of having had everything taken away from him. As a result of successfully overcoming all these medical obstacles, both necessary and unnecessary, and surviving the supposedly unsurvivable, and having to walk as a newborn being into an unknown future.
And is that a happy ending?
And with a knowing acceptance that of that bargain, that this means I must, with gleeful defiance, accept both the wonders of life and all the losses that come from continuing to live life. And what was the question? Sorry.
I said, is that a happy ending? Gleeful defiance sounds like a happy ending.
I think it's an incredibly happy ending. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a realistically happy ending. It's a happy ending that includes the realistic adult acceptance of the bargains of life that everybody does.
Evan Handler, that's all we have time for. Thank you
okay.
so much for joining us.
Sure.
Whatever we can't fit into this half hour, we'll share on our Science Goes to the Movies Facebook page. And if you want to watch past episodes, check us out at www.cuny.tv under the Science tab, or download our app to keep up with everything related to Science Goes to the Movies all in one place.